Hey, welcome to our Bible study time. We're glad that you're with us. In just a few moments, we're going to be in First Samuel, looking at the third chapter. You need to have your Bibles out. You need to have pen and paper ready to be able to write some notes down, jot some things down to consider, passages to look up and read when this broadcast is over. But we're glad you're with us. And if you're joining us from the greater Magnolia area, or perhaps from somewhere else around the country or around the world, we're glad that you're with us. We hope our Bible study time is going to be a blessing to you. Welcome to Bible study time. Before you begin the study, you might want to go back and review some of the things that you read in chapter 2. Take a look at the notes that you may have taken when I taught from that chapter. You'll find that to be very helpful as we progress through, and particularly as it relates to the things in this chapter. So if you need to pause the recording to refresh your memory, pull back and take a look at those things, go ahead and do that at this time, and then we'll begin when you're ready. As we begin this study of 1 Samuel chapter 3, we want to begin with prayer. So would you bow with me, please? Father, as we begin this study, we ask your blessings on each one of us. We ask for your wisdom, and we ask, Father, that you give us understanding. May we see this, Father, as a message to us, a message that will increase our faith, will strengthen our understanding of you and of how you relate and deal with us. We're thankful, Father, for the word that you have provided us with. I ask for your blessings and wisdom in my explanation of the things that we're going to be looking at tonight. And I ask, Father, your blessing on all of us as we study together. It is in the name of Christ we pray. Remember that back in the introduction to this book, I told you this is much more than a collection of stories about things that happened in Israel as the period of Judges draws to a close and the monarchy begins. And I also told you in that introduction to the study that the writer is not interested in chronology nearly as much as he is in getting you and I, the readers, to grasp spiritual lessons. Now, chapters 3 and 4 are great examples of what I'm talking about in that regard. Now, as far as the chronology of the life of Samuel goes, the things that we're going to read here in chapter 3 fit right in. In other words, you take back a look at chapter 1. We see his mother Hannah praying to God that God would give her a son. Then we see that she conceives and gives birth to a son and names him Samuel. Next, we're told that when he was weaned, perhaps 3 to 4 years of age, he's brought by his parents to Shiloh, where he is given to God, and that the high priest Eli now has the responsibility of raising up the lad and of training him to be in life service to God. In chapter 2, the focus wasn't so much on Samuel as it was on things that were developing at that time in Samuel's life. So we see the gratitude and praise of faithful Hannah in answer to her prayers. We also, however, see the sins of the unfaithful sons of Eli, Hophni and Phinehas. And we see a prophecy given concerning their deaths because of their wickedness. We see Samuel in chapter 2 simply as one growing up in the tabernacle, serving the Lord, wearing an ephod, growing spiritually as well as physically. But the spotlight isn't really on Samuel in chapter 2. Mostly it falls on the grievous sins of Eli's sons. Here in chapter 3, however, the spotlight is on Samuel. Even what is revealed to Samuel concerning the house of Eli is just that. It's a revelation given to Samuel and then revealed by Samuel to Eli. So as far as the chronology goes, the call to ministry recorded in this chapter is exactly where it should be, but it is the call itself. That's the important thing. What that call included concerning judgment on the house of Eli, that's the important thing. Those two things are really bound up in this one single event, and they are the things that matter as we read this chapter. God sees all. God knows all. God pronounces judgments, and God fulfills judgments. And finally, we'll see that God is preparing Samuel for his life's work. And so the opening statement of this chapter and the final statement of this chapter will show us that this is not just about curiously interesting things that happened to Samuel when he was a boy growing up in Shiloh. It's about God communicating to a young boy who has a heart for God. It's about God demonstrating to the nation that Samuel is called to be his prophet. Verse 1 says, "Now the boy Samuel was ministering to the Lord before Eli, and word from the Lord was rare in those days. Visions were infrequent." The statement being made here sets the stage for what follows throughout this chapter. How old is Samuel at the time of these events? Well, that we don't know, but there are some things that we can logically conclude. The descriptions that are given of Samuel in chapter 2 are found in verse 11, where it says, "But the boy ministered to the Lord before Eli the priest." In verse 18, Samuel was ministering before the Lord as a boy, wearing a little linen ephod. Verses 19 through 21, we're told that he's young enough that his mother would come up each year and present him with a little robe. And it says, "And the boy Samuel grew before the Lord." In verse 26, "Now the boy was growing in stature and in favor with both the Lord and with men." So in chapter 2, Samuel is only mentioned 5 times, or rather in 5 verses, and in them we see him as a boy growing physically and growing spiritually. So chapter 3, verse 1 continues that vein of thought that he is a child. "Now the boy Samuel was ministering to the Lord before Eli." We don't know how old he was, but he's young enough, even at the time of the event that's about to be dealt with, he's still young enough to simply be called. Look again at the last part of the verse. "And word from the Lord was rare in those days. Visions were infrequent." Prophets bring a word from the Lord. The distinction between true prophets and false prophets is the success or the failure of their words. The false prophets also begin messages with a "Thus saith the Lord," when in fact the Lord has not spoken to them at all. And their prophecies fail. And it's in that failure that we have the ultimate proof that they do not speak a word from God, no matter how much they insist that they do. Again, it says visions were infrequent. Well, visions were means by which God revealed himself and his words to the prophets. The priesthood, in this case, under Eli's supervision, is deeply corrupt, as we've already indicated. And God's not communicating with a priesthood that does not honor him. Also bear in mind that Eli is not just the high priest at Shiloh, he's also God's judge over Israel. At the time of his death, we're told he will have judged Israel for 40 years, chapter 4 and verse 18. But he's proven himself unworthy and unfaithful in that he honors his sons over God, chapter 2, verse 29. And so God is not communicating with his people beyond what they have in the written law. The word of the Lord was rare in those days. Visions were infrequent. There's almost a vacuum of silence. But God is about to break his silence in calling Samuel to be his prophet. In verse 2, "It happened at that time as Eli was lying down in his place. Now his eyesight had begun to grow dim and he could not see well. And the lamp of God had not yet gone out. And Samuel was lying down in the temple of the Lord where the ark of God was, that the Lord called Samuel. And he said, Here I am." What happened sometime during the night. The language rather indicates that the priests were to trim the lamp in the holy place every evening before twilight, and then keep the lamp going all through the night. It was to be fueled by oil extracted from beaten olives Exodus 27, verse 21, also chapter 30 and verse 8. Leviticus chapter 24, verse 2. In 2 Chronicles chapter 13, verse 11. Those are some passages that give us some insights as to how that took place. And we need to understand that even though it uses the word temple, Samuel is not sleeping in the temple. The temple has not even yet been constructed. Recall in the introduction that we noted that the one who compiles the information that we know of today is 1 Samuel. Could have been one of any of three of the prophets mentioned, and it would have been one that would have been writing about things well after the fact that the temple has been erected, and so for that audience, temple would be the word that they would understand. Samuel's not sleeping in the temple, and he's also not sleeping in the holy place, nor is he in the Holy of Holies. And we're probably meant to understand that he is in quarters set up within the outer court of the tabernacle for the benefit of those priests serving there, much like the rooms that later will be built for the priest when Solomon's temple is built. We're also told, parenthetically in this verse, that Samuel's eyesight is almost gone. That explains why Samuel would immediately rise and come to Eli's aid, thinking the old man who has difficulty seeing needs help. In the previous chapter, the prophet sent to Eli by the Lord had asked him a rhetorical question. Why do you kick at my sacrifice and at my offering, which I have commanded in my dwelling, and honor your sons above me by making yourselves fat with the choicest of every offering of my people Israel? Chapter 2 and verse 29. And in the next chapter, we'll see that at the time of his death, Eli is completely blind. That's chapter 4 and verse 15. And he's very old and very heavy also, chapter 4 and verse 18. So the picture that we have of Samuel is a young boy growing into manhood, growing in wisdom and stature and favor. The picture that we have of Eli is an aged man who by this time is losing his eyesight quickly, who is fat, and who is very old. Let me break in here for a minute and offer an apology. First of all, sometimes I lose the audio on the track, and I don't know why it does that. I will have it when I put it in there initially, and it seems to be fine, and then when I make some edits and go back, I can't find it. I'm probably doing something wrong. This is new software for me, and I apologize for things that make this kind of rough. And secondly, sometimes I misspeak. I went back and noticed about halfway through that last clip that I referred to Samuel nearly losing his eyesight, and of course it's not Samuel, it's Eli. If you haven't figured it out yet, this isn't a professionally done and professionally dubbed video. I'm just an old country boy preacher from West Texas and trying to lead us in a Bible study. And I apologize for anything that I say or production problems that cause this to be a little difficult to follow. I hope that you'll do your best, and I promise you I'm doing mine as well. Verse 5. Then he ran to Eli and said, "Here I am, for you called me." But he said, "I did not call. Lie down again." So he went and lay down. The Lord called yet again, "Samuel." So Samuel arose and went to Eli and said, "Here I am, for you called me." But he answered, "I did not call, my son. Lie down again." Now Samuel did not yet know the Lord, nor had the word of the Lord yet been revealed to him. So the Lord called Samuel again for the third time. And he arose and went to Eli and said, "Here I am, for you called me." Then Eli discerned that the Lord was calling the boy. So it's Eli who eventually realized that God was calling Samuel. And the reason why this is not immediately obvious to Eli, nor immediately obvious to Samuel, was explained in the last statement of chapter 3, verse 1. Word from the Lord was rare in those days. Visions were infrequent. The expression in verse 7 that Samuel did not yet know the Lord is not to be understood as an absolute ignorance of the existence of God. The explanation of what is meant by that statement is found right there in the verse. Until that moment, Samuel's not been called by God. He's never been given a word from God. And so just as the two expressions in chapter 3, verse 1 at the end of the verse convey the same meaning, well, here in verse 7, these two expressions convey the same thought. God had not previously revealed himself to Samuel, nor indicated in any way that Samuel was to be his prophet. Verse 9, and Eli said to Samuel, go lie down, and it shall be if he calls you that you shall say, speak, Lord, for your servant is listening. So Samuel went and lay down in his place. Then the Lord came and stood and called as at other times, Samuel, Samuel. And Samuel said, speak, for your servant is listening. You know, I think that this exchange, these calls of Samuel, him getting up and checking with Eli eventually realizing that it is the Lord calling Samuel, the Lord calling again, Samuel responding to the Lord in the appropriate way. I think there is more to this than just telling us this is how Samuel got his prophetic call. I think we also need to realize that the writer has gone to great pains to show us Samuel has a heart for obedience. And each of the previous times he was called, he got up to check on Eli in an obedience, a respectful obedience, if you will. And when his fourth call comes, Samuel is going to be obedient to the instructions that Eli gave him. And obedience to God is one of the keys, one of the themes in this book. It is a heart matter with Samuel that he does what God tells him to do. We'll see that consistently in him. He is obedient to God. Of course, we'll also see that obedience was not so much a conviction of the heart of King Saul, as the text will demonstrate. Verse 11, the Lord said to Samuel, behold, I'm about to do a thing in Israel at which both ears of everyone who hears it will tingle. In that day, I will carry out against Eli all that I have spoken concerning his house from beginning to end. For I've told him that I'm about to judge his house forever for the iniquity which he knew, because his sons brought a curse on themselves, and he did not rebuke them. Therefore, I have sworn to the house of Eli that the iniquity of Eli's house shall not be atoned for by sacrifice or offering forever. A thing in Israel at which both ears of everyone who hears it will tingle. You talk about a graphic word picture. This expression, of course, is a figure of speech, and this is not the only place in the Old Testament you'll see this expression used. You'll find it again in 2 Kings chapter 21 and verse 12, again in Jeremiah chapter 19 and verse 3, and the idea repeated again in the book of Habakkuk chapter 1 in verse 5. It's always associated with unbelievably horrific news. It's never good news. It's always the worst kind of news, a shocking thing. You know, if what the prophet had said to Eli was said in confidence, and I suspect that it was, and Eli chose to keep it a secret, and I would imagine that he would have done that, well, that secret's about to be known. And the whole nation is going to be shocked by the severity of the calamity that is about to befall. The corruption of the priesthood, that was already known by the people, well known by the people of Israel. They saw it every time that they came to Shiloh to offer up their sacrifices, and it was detailed in chapter 2, verses 12 through 17. And they talked about it, chapter 2 and verse 22. Also, the immorality of Eli's sons was a national shame, verse 22. Does God know what's going on? Does God care about what's going on? Well, the answer to those questions is about to be given to the people in a way that will shock every Israelite in the land. Both ears of those who hear it will tingle. Verse 15. So Samuel lay down until morning. Then he opened the doors of the house of the Lord. But Samuel was afraid to tell the vision to Eli. Then Eli called Samuel and said, Samuel, my son. And he said, Here I am. He said, What is the word that he spoke to you? Please do not hide it from me. May God do so to you and more also if you hide anything from me of all the words that he spoke to you. So Samuel told him everything and hid nothing from him. And he said, It is the Lord. Let him do what seems good to him. The value of a prophet is that he reveals what God tells him to reveal to those that God intends to hear it. Others will often counsel against a revelation that's not encouraging. You'll see an example of that, for instance, in 1 Kings 22, 13 through 14, when Micaiah is asked to reveal God's will, but Zedekiah, a false prophet, doesn't want him to say anything other than what has already been agreed upon by the other false prophets. In Jeremiah's day, the people will be very bold to say, we don't want to hear the things that you tell us. Here's what we want to hear. Samuel makes his decision to speak what God has revealed, and we're going to see that he never shrinks from that duty. You know, a parallel to this concept in the New Testament is the charge that Paul gives to Timothy to preach the word, to be instant in season and out of season in 2 Timothy chapter 4, verses 1 through 5. People don't always want to hear sermons that condemn their sinful life choices and lifestyles. They don't like to have their ears tingled. They like to have their ears tickled. And preachers can sometimes find themselves without a job, or at least without an audience. But the charge is not to tell people what they want to hear. It's to tell people what God says they need to hear. We need to be sober when we think about God's word. If it steps on our toes, as some preachers say, it's meant to step on our heart. We need to understand that it's God's discipline for us, as the Hebrew writer says, because he loves us, because he wants to bring us back into subjection and obedience to him. He wants to spend eternity with us. So Eli can only confirm that God's will is going to be done as God wills it. When he hears this bad news, it's confirmation of what he's already been told by the unnamed prophet. He's right to say God's will be done. You know, he's served God and he's judged God's people for a long time. And all these things are to his credit. And I think that is intimated or implied in chapter 2 and verse 33. But he's also been, we might say, criminally indulgent in the sins of his own sons. Eli said far too little, and he said it far too late. And if Eli had been thinking perhaps the Lord might relent from the promises that was given through the unnamed prophet, well, now he has confirmation through God's newest prophet that God is going to do what seems good to him. Verse 19. Thus Samuel grew, and the Lord was with him, and let none of his words fail. All Israel from Dan even to Beersheba knew that Samuel was confirmed as a prophet of the Lord. And the Lord appeared again at Shiloh, because the Lord revealed himself to Samuel at Shiloh by the word of the Lord. Verses 19 and 20, while they speak to the immediate present, this event that takes place sometime during the night, and then Samuel's revealing it to Eli the next morning, they also speak about the entire ministry of Samuel as a prophet, a very long ministry, by the way. A ministry that we're told in chapter 7, verse 15, would last for the rest of his life. Samuel's words were recognized as being the utterances of God because they never failed. And from Dan to Beersheba is an expression that really means from top to bottom, all throughout the land, in every tribal territory, in every city, in every village throughout the land, people knew that God had confirmed Samuel as a prophet because the things that Samuel said always came to pass. God never let a single word fail. You know, if you go back to the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 18, the people were told by Moses before they cross into the promised land and receive it, that men would come along in the future claiming to be prophets of God. And they were to test the words of those who claimed to be prophets. Deuteronomy chapter 18, verses 20 through 22. If in fact what the prophet said did not come to pass, then they were not to fear those prophets. They weren't from the Lord. I want to be clear on what I'm about to say. Today, we no longer live in the age of prophecy. As Paul wrote in his letter to the church of Corinth, the gift of prophecy is done away with, 1 Corinthians 13, verse 8, having accomplished its purposes. It was replaced by the perfect that was to come. And that perfection is the completely revealed will of the Lord in all matters of faith, which are found in the New Testament, Jude verses 3 and 5. In other words, there is nothing else that we need to instruct us in how to live a life of godliness before the Father. So there are no current prophets. We don't need to fear the modern day self-acclaimed prophet. And like Moses' generation, we're also commanded to test the spirits for the very reason, as John says in 1 John chapter 4, verse 1, for many false prophets have gone out into the world. When modern day false prophets make confident assertions about things like the end of the world, when they tell us to do something that contradicts what is in the New Testament, for instance, matters regarding salvation or daily Christian living, we're not to believe them. We're not to follow them. We are to understand that what they preach is not from God, and it is an accursed message, Galatians chapter 1, verses 6 through 10. It's what we have in the New Testament that's true. What we have in the New Testament was given to us by the apostles, who got it by the Holy Spirit. And Jesus said it is the very revelation given through the Holy Spirit to them that contains the words that Jesus Christ himself gives. You can read that in detail in the Gospel of John, chapter 16, verses 13 through 15. If a person comes along today claiming to have truth, and you can't find that truth in the New Testament, it's not truth. So just as all of Israel knew Samuel to be a true prophet of God because none of his words failed, what you and I have today given to us in the New Testament is known to be from God. It's all true. None of it fails. Anyone advocating a different doctrine, making predictions not found in Scripture, calling us to do what they instruct as opposed to what we see in Scripture, are necessarily false prophets. All right, our next lesson will be taken from 1 Samuel chapter 4. I hope that you've enjoyed this study. I hope that you will prayerfully consider the things we've talked about. If you have any questions about things that we've looked at, feel free to contact us at the church office. Go on our website, send us an email. We'll do our best to answer those questions. So you take care now, and God bless.